Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something really fascinating. This is kind of a strange story. We're going to be talking about Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. And what's interesting here is this kind of intersection between, well, it seems like spirituality and big business and even politics all kind of mix up together.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating case. On the surface, you've got Chris Butler. He's a charismatic yoga teacher. He became kind of a big deal in Hawaii back in the 70s. But beneath that, there are all these allegations of, kind of cult-like practices, a controversial business empire,
Yeah.
and even ties to a U.S. congresswoman.
Wow. Okay. So let's just start with Butler himself then. One thing that I found really interesting is that he was, at least initially, connected with the Hare Krishna movement. I mean, yoga and Hare Krishnas. That's not something you see every day, right?
Yeah, it might seem a little unusual, but there is a connection there. They both kind of draw from the same branch of Hinduism. It's called Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And they both the Hare Krishnas and Butler's group, they emphasize this devotion to a guru, and it's sort of like a path to enlightenment. Surrender yourself to the guru. But Butler's relationship with the Hare Krishnas kind of went sour. Their leader, Prabhupada, accused Butler of basically stealing money, misappropriating funds, and this ultimately led to Butler going off and forming his own group. It's called the Science of Identity Foundation, SEF for short.
So it sounds like he kind of, I don't know, maybe repackaged these ancient Hindu teachings and kind of made them cool for a modern audience, I guess.
You could put it that way. Although there's definitely more to it than just that. A lot of former members of SIFE have come forward with some pretty disturbing stories. They describe the group as being, having these cult-like qualities, and they say that Butler demands total loyalty from his followers. So, that raises some questions about how his teachings maybe differ from, like the traditional principles of Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
That's interesting. And,
Yeah.
to make things even a little more strange,
Yeah.
Butler is actually married to Wailana. She's pretty famous herself. She's a very successful yoga instructor. But here's the thing. They're never photographed together.
Yeah.
Like ever. What's the deal with that? Is he trying to keep a low profile or something? Or is there maybe more to it?
It's a question a lot of people have,
Yeah.
The secrecy surrounding their marriage it's definitely a little odd. And, it could be that he's trying to control the image of himself and Saif very carefully. But let's maybe switch gears for a minute and talk about the business side of all of this.
Sure, yeah. Because I know there are some pretty serious accusations out there that Saif is connected to this controversial multi-level marketing company called QEnt.
That's right. And we're not talking about some small operation here. QNet is global. It's huge. And you've got figures like Joseph Bismark and Vijay Eswaran, who are kind of, the main players there. And these guys have been in legal trouble in multiple countries because they're accused of running, essentially a pyramid scheme, one that targets vulnerable people.
Wow. So are we talking about a situation where people are like drawn in, with the promise of this spiritual kind of community, and then maybe they're pressured into joining this business venture that could actually end up exploiting them? That's pretty messed up.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the big concerns here. The way SEF and QNet are supposedly all mixed up together, it's a pretty troubling picture. Imagine, you join a group, you're looking for, some spiritual guidance, a community, that sort of thing. And then, next thing you know, you're tangled up in this complicated business thing that might actually end up, draining your bank account and leaving you isolated.
That's just wild. It's hard to understand, how people could get sucked into that.
Yeah.
What kind of influence does this guy Butler have over his followers, I mean, why wouldn't they question any of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to understand that, we need to kind of go deeper, I think, into how things work inside SEF and look at how the way they treat their devotees changes over time. Some former members, they've talked about this gradual shift that happens. Like at first, it's all about spiritual growth in the community, and then slowly things get more controlling and possibly even harmful.
So it's not like people join SIF knowing that they're getting into something like a cult, right? It's more subtle than that.
Exactly. It's this gradual process. The demands, the need for loyalty, the obedience, it all gets more and more intense over time. And that makes it really tough for people to even recognize the red flags, or to ask for help. They can end up feeling really trapped emotionally and maybe even financially.
This whole thing is starting to sound like a house of cards about to fall apart.
Mhm.
But before we go any further, there's another piece to this puzzle that we need to talk about. Politics. I hear there's a connection between Seth and Tulsi Gabbard. She's a former U.S. congresswoman, and she even ran for president, right?
Yeah, the connection is definitely there. Gabbard grew up in SIF, and her family has strong ties to the organization. So, it makes you wonder, to what extent were her political views and her career shaped by Butler's teachings, by the SIF network?
Whoa, that's crazy. A potential presidential candidate being influenced by a group that people say is like a cult. This just gets wilder and wilder.
Yeah, it's a pretty controversial issue for sure. Some people argue that her stances on certain issues, and even the people she had on her political team, were influenced by SIF. But Gabbard herself denies that there was any, undue influence. And it's important for us to not jump to conclusions or make assumptions,
Yeah.
especially without solid evidence.
Right, of course. So, okay, here we are with spirituality and business and politics. It's all tangled up, right? It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And I'm already thinking about, like, if you're caught up in this, how do you even navigate that kind of situation?
And that's exactly where we need to focus next, I think. We need to hear from the people who were actually in SIF, the former members. Their stories are really important for understanding what goes on inside the group and the consequences of getting tangled up in this whole mess.
I'm ready to hear what they have to say. Their stories could be really eye-opening for anyone who's ever been in a similar situation or worried about someone who has.
One of the really important things to understand here is that a lot of former F members, they talk about this kind of gradual shift in their experience in the group. Like in the beginning, they were really drawn to the sense of community, and the idea of spiritual growth and all that. But as time went on, things kind of took a darker turn.
Okay, so what did this darker turn actually look like for people?
Well, some former devotees have shared some pretty disturbing accounts. Actually, they talk about these really strict rules and this almost suffocating demand for loyalty to Butler. Some people even said they were pressured to like distance themselves from their own families, their friends. It's like they were being isolated, and their only support system became F itself.
Man, it's sad to hear. It's like they were being systematically cut off from anyone who might, challenge Butler's authority or just offer a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And that isolation, it makes people, much more vulnerable to manipulation and control. There are even stories of members being fined for like really minor things, like questioning Butler's teachings. And some people have described being pressured to, get this, to drink water that was used to wash Butler's feet. They were told it was like a way to show their devotion.
Wait, hold on. Drinking water that was used to wash his feet? Seriously. That's just, I don't know, it's bizarre. And more than a little disturbing, don't you think? I mean, what kind of psychological impact does that kind of stuff have on people?
Yeah, you're right to be concerned about that. I mean, those actions, even though they're presented as these spiritual practices, they really raise some red flags about, potential psychological manipulation, maybe even abuse of power. We talked earlier about Gaudiya Vaishnavism, the tradition that Butler's teachings are supposedly based on. And it's true that they emphasize devotion to a guru, but this just seems like it's taking things way too far. It's super, it's potentially really harmful.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, how could anyone be convinced that drinking someone's foot-washing water is somehow a path to enlightenment? It's just crazy.
Well, and the thing is, it's often this very gradual process. People don't join SIF, knowing that they're going to be doing these weird rituals. It starts out subtle, right? With the promise of community and spiritual guidance. And then these demands and the unusual practices, they just kind of creep in over time. And they're presented as tests of devotion or opportunities to become more spiritually connected.
Man, it's like that analogy of the frog being slowly boiled alive, right? They don't realize the danger until it's too late.
It's a good analogy. And sadly, by the time a lot of people realize, how much control there is, how manipulative it all is, they might feel trapped. Not just emotionally, but financially too. Remember that connection to QNet?
Oh, right, that multi-level marketing company we talked about before.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like a double whammy then. People are potentially being manipulated within this spiritual group, and they're also being pulled into this business venture that could end up ruining them financially.
Exactly. It's a really worrying combination. And even though Butler says he's done nothing wrong, that both Ceph and QNet are totally ethical, you can't ignore the fact that so many former members have come forward with these really similar stories.
Yeah, it definitely raises some serious questions. I mean, we're hearing about strict rules, isolation from loved ones, these strange practices, and then on top of that, this whole shady business thing. It's a pretty clear pattern, hard to ignore.
Yeah, and that pattern becomes even more alarming when you think about how the way Seith treats its devotees seems to change over time. The longer someone stays in the group, the tighter the control gets, and the harder it is for them to leave.
So it's not just about recruiting people, it's about keeping them trapped, psychologically and financially.
That's one of the key takeaways here. We're not just talking about, a charismatic leader and a bunch of followers. We're talking about potentially a whole system of control and exploitation.
Which brings us back to that question we were asking before. Once someone is in this situation, how do they get out? How do they navigate that?
Well, that's where the stories of the people who did manage to leave C become really important. They can give us some insight into just how difficult it is to break free from a group that has this much control over your life.
I'm really interested to hear what they have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, their experiences could have some really valuable lessons for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation, right? So we've talked about how the longer someone's in SUF, the harder it is to get out. But what does that actually look like? And what kind of challenges do people face when they finally try to leave?
Oh, the challenges are really significant. I mean, imagine, you've spent years with this group and your beliefs, your relationships, even your finances have been controlled by them. And then you leave. A lot of former SUF members say they just felt lost, completely disoriented, like they were living in a bubble and then suddenly the bubble burst and the world is this totally different place than what they were taught to believe.
Wow, that's heavy. It's like waking up from a dream, but the consequences of that dream are real and they can be really tough to deal with.
Exactly. And often, these people have to rebuild relationships with their families and friends, people they might have pushed away while they were in SUF, and they may have trouble finding a job because, their skills and experience might be all tied up with the group. And then there's the emotional and psychological impact. I mean, a lot of former members talk about feeling guilty, ashamed, anxious. Some even have PTSD because of what they went through.
It's a reminder that the damage these groups can do, it doesn't just go away when you leave. It can stick with you for years and affect every part of your life.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to, to talk about this stuff, to raise awareness. And there are resources out there to help people who have been affected by these kinds of groups. There's the Education Institute, for example. They offer support for former cult members and their families, help them heal, and get their lives back on track.
That's good to know that there's help out there. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Chris Butler and Seif, what are the main things you want our listeners to remember?
Well, I think it's really important to understand that, anyone can be vulnerable to these kinds of groups. Seif, they prey on people who are looking for connection, for a purpose in life, spiritual meaning. It's not like you're weak or naive if you get caught up in something like this. The important thing is to know the warning signs, to trust your gut, and if something feels wrong, to get help.
Yeah, you make a good point. It's easy to sit back and judge, to think, how could anyone fall for this? But these groups, they know what they're doing. They're really good at manipulating people.
Exactly. So critical thinking is key, Question everything, especially when it comes to faith and belief. Don't be afraid to challenge authority, to get different perspectives. Real spirituality, it shouldn't be about control and exploitation. It should empower you, uplift you.
Well, this has been a pretty wild ride. I mean, we started out talking about Chris Butler, this yoga teacher, and ended up going down this rabbit hole of spirituality, shady business practices, and even politics. Who knew?
Yeah, it's quite a story. And, even though we've talked about a lot of disturbing things today, I do think there's a message of hope here. The people who managed to escape Seif, they showed incredible courage and resilience. Their stories prove that even when things seem really dark, the human spirit can still triumph.
That's a great note to end on. So, to everyone listening, stay informed, stay critical, and most importantly, trust your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. And remember, there's help out there. You don't have to go through this alone. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.